Okay. Hello, good evening, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming along to this November event of the Canterbury Socialist Society. My name's Tom. I'm just going to very briefly introduce the talk and do a tiny bit of admin stuff. Admin stuff first. If you haven't been to one of our talks before, we do these on the Wednesday of every month in Space Academy, which is really awesome. I'll take this opportunity to thank Space Academy for being one of our continuing hosts. It's been really great. It's been 2 years. And it's been really, really good to be able to continue doing stuff here. If you aren't on our mailing list, there's a mailing list sign up sheet just around the corner there. If you're curious about the Canterbury Socialist Society, just come to me or to be honest, Byron, anyone sitting at that table. Most of the people in there could probably tell you a little bit about it if you want to know a bit more. Otherwise, I will pretty much leave it there. Just briefly mention, if you're a Socialist Society member, please check your emails this week about the weekend's events commemorating the 70 years of the 1951 strike. It'd be really good to get people along to that as much as possible. It is a members event just because of the COVID restrictions, unfortunately. But if you want to be a member, you can definitely come along. Just come talk to one of us after the talk. And the other thing is, our next event is just our regular social drinks next week. That's Smash Ballot, from 6 p.m. just around the corner. Also on the Wednesday, so third Wednesday of every month we do that, and it's my morning with Smash Ballot. To introduce this event very quickly, I have been sort of vaguely on the left, on the socialist, spectrum. More than one sense, I'm sure, for about 10 years, and pretty much as soon as I got into it in Christchurch, I met Byron. I believe back then it was a counter demonstration because the far right in Christchurch were having a rally, and I thought that was great, so I ended up meeting a lot of socialists through saying we should counter demonstrate that. And 10 years later, and I still know Byron, and that's a good sign in socialist left, because we haven't burnt any bridges thus far, so that's not doing too badly. Byron has been a socialist and an activist in Christchurch for quite a while, a bit longer than me for sure. He's run for mayor in the past on the socialist platform with the Marxist organisation. More recently, it's been focused more on YouTube content, following the New Zealand far right and sort of what they're up to. So it's worth checking that out. And it's really good to have Byron here to talk about looking back a decade at the social movements of 2011 internationally. So the indignados, the Arab Spring, things like that, which as I'd only just recently entered the scene, didn't know very much about it at all. And probably learned a fair amount from this talk because I hadn't really gone back to figure it out myself. But we're also here for Byron's book launch. Will not be talking too much about Occupy Christchurch, but that is what the book is about. It's an oral history of Occupy Christchurch now in readable format. So we'll be able to have a chat about that once we break up at the end to sort of mingle and stuff, and Byron has some books for sale and stuff like that. But for now, I just want to really welcome Byron and thank him for doing the talk. We'll thank you.
Is this thing quick? Okay, go.
How's everyone here? Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the Canterbury Socialist Society for hosting this event. It's a nice change to be speaking on a topic other than the far right and disinformation, which, as Tom mentioned, I've been doing a lot of work on lately. But this event tonight is a launch for the book here, Occupy Christchurch in Our Own Words, which is an oral history of the Occupy protest in Christchurch, which I started recording in 2012. Not long after the encampment in Hadley Park, as it was, rather than in the central square, because it was right after the earthquake. Not long after that encampment ended, and I recorded interviews with, there are 14 different people, a couple of whom are in this room right now, who were interviewed, and they're all published together in this book. The reason I recorded an oral history of the Occupy movement here was mostly because I worried that if I didn't, nobody else would, and that time would be forgotten. And while I don't think it's a significant New Zealand social movement, it was a part of a much larger global social movement that was going on at the time. And I remember being young and wanting to learn about things like 1968 and everything that was happening then around the world, and then looking, well, what was happening locally, how did it influence this country, what was happening here. And I think 2011 is only a decade behind us now, but maybe in a few more years, young people coming to the left will be thinking the same thing about 2011, because it was actually a quite significant year in world history. So the talk tonight is not going to talk very much about the local situation, but I will touch on a bit and we can talk about it more in the question time afterwards. I'm going to look mostly at the global situation in 2011, which inspired the protest here, and then from there inspired me to record this oral history and do it in the book there. So, what sparked these events was this young man, Mohamed Bouazizi, who was a fruit vendor in Tunisia, who in December 2010 self-immolated in protest against the treatment that he was getting from authorities who were hassling him as he was selling his fruit on the street, breaking his scales, things like that. And I've got some quotes here from an article that was published in Al Jazeera not long after that event. Mohamed Bouazizi is emerging as a symbol of the wider plight of millions of young Arabs who are struggling to improve their living conditions. Like many across the Arab world, Bouazizi discovered that a university degree was insignificant to secure decent employment. The roots of this Tunisian uprising are to be found in the lethal combination of poverty, unemployment, and political repression, three characteristics of most Arab societies. So his suicide sparked protests in Tunisia, but they wouldn't have happened without this wider social context of unemployment and a lack of being able to see a future for young people in the area. So to go a bit more into the economic situation in the region, youth unemployment was at 20%. And this is a part of the world where at that time 2/3 of the population were under 30. In Egypt, 92% of the unemployed were first-time job seekers. And unemployment in the 20 to 25 age range in Egypt rose to 28%. And in Tunisia, where Mohamed Bouazizi was, it was at 30%. In Yemen, closer to 50%. Another thing that contributed, November 2010, WikiLeaks, along with 5 major newspapers, published the first 220 of a large cache of leaked documents labelled confidential, which included descriptions of corruption and repression by the Tunisian regime. So just a quote from one of them here, which was titled, "Trouble Tunisia, what should we do?" This is from the US Embassy. Many Tunisians are frustrated by the lack of political freedom and angered by first family corruption, high unemployment and regional inequalities. Despite Tunisia's economic and social progress, its record on political freedoms is poor. Tunisia is a police state with little freedom of expression or association and serious human rights problems. So Ben Ali, who was the president at that time, Ben Ali and his regime have lost touch with the Tunisian people. They tolerate no advice or criticism, whether domestic or international. Increasingly, they rely on the police for control and focus on preserving power. And corruption in the inner circle is growing. Even average Tunisians are now keenly aware of it, and the chorus of complaints is rising. So this is the year before. This is the situation now. So speaking of first family corruption, this is Sakar al-Matari, the son-in-law to President Ben Ali. His assets included a shipping cruise line, a pharmaceutical manufacturing firm, several real estate companies, a large tiger named Pasha living in a cage, which consumes 4 chickens a day. So remember, this is a country with 20% youth unemployment, 2/3 of the population under 30, and this is the son-in-law of the president. And I mean, just look at him. You would revolt, wouldn't you? And they did. And the regime in Tunisia fell quite quickly. So Mohamed Bouazizi's self-immolation was on December the 10th, 2010. 29th, after 10 days of protest, Ben Ali, the president, appears on television, promising action on job creation, but also stating the law will be applied in all fairness to protesters. January 9th, 2011, protesters clashed with police, deaths of protesters occur. But then by the 14th of January 2011, Ben Ali has fled to Saudi Arabia.
Where else?
Elsewhere in the region, in Egypt, people are starting to protest and they're chanting, "We are next, we are next." Ben Ali, tell Mubarak that he is next, Mubarak being the president in Egypt at the time. So the situation in Egypt, once again we have a young man setting fire to himself near the Egyptian parliament, in this case on January 17th, 2011. The next day, activists announced plans for a nationwide day of anger. 25th of January, first coordinated protests happened across Egypt, demanding Mubarak's resignation. February 1st, after a week of political manoeuvring, Mubarak announces he will step down at the next election. And this protest movement spreads even further. So February 25th, we get the Middle East Day of Rage. In Iraq, there are protests against corruption in the state of basic services. In Yemen, 30,000 anti-government demonstrators in Sana'a, and more than 100,000 nationwide. Students, tribesmen, opposition, young professionals flood the streets around the university where protesters have begun camping. In Jordan, 5,000 people protest in the capital, chanting, "The people want the reform of the regime, we want a fair electoral law, and people want an electric government." Elected government. Phrases that I'm sure are much more rhythmic in Arabic than in English translation. And in Palestine, the Palestinian Authority authorises a day of rage to protest against the US veto of a UN Security Council resolution condemning Israeli settlements. That was called off without an explanation from the Palestinian Authority, but an unofficial protest still occurs. In Bahrain, tens of thousands of anti-government protesters marched in the capital, many of them waving the country's red and black flag, chanting, "No dialogue before the government is dissolved," and "For Bahrain's future, we are not afraid to be killed." Again, probably more rhythmic in Arabic. After this, in Tunisia, tens of thousands are demanding the resignation of the Prime Minister. This is the new Prime Minister after Ben Ali has fled to Saudi Arabia, because the new Prime Minister is seen as an ally of his. In Egypt, protesters returned to Tahrir Square again to demand faster paced reforms and a new cabinet to replace the one that included many figures from the previous regime, as well as the release of all political prisoners. And some really interesting things happened in Egypt in terms of the labour movement there. So by late 2011, there's a strike wave forcing the renationalisation of enterprises that were sold off under Mubarak. Early in 2012, the number of struggles counted by the Egyptian Centre for Economic and Social Rights hovers around 250 industrial disputes per month. The months of the presidential election campaign witnessed a relative lull, but the first months of the newly elected president's time in office saw around 1,600 strikes and occupations. Yemen, similar grievances to the rest of the region, but also opposition to constitutional changes the government was planning. President Ali Abdullah Saleh initially refuses to step down, but he begins to lose control of the country. With numerous opposition groups, Yemen comes close to civil war, with protests becoming violent. By October 2011, Human Rights Watch was able to confirm 225 deaths and over 1,000 wounded, many from firearms. But following this, Salah does step down. Like Ben Ali before him, he flees to Saudi Arabia on a Gulf Cooperation Council plan to sign a Gulf Cooperation Council plan for political transition. He agrees to legally transfer the powers of the presidency to his deputy within 30 days, and finally step down before the presidential election in February 2012 in exchange for immunity and immunity from prosecution for himself and for his family. In Algeria, protests occur over high unemployment and food prices. We see another self-immolation in January. A young man, after failing to find a job in a house, and much like in Tunisia before that, riots erupt after his death. Protesters clash with police who have been ordered to enforce a protest ban. And then by March, the government's using some of the oil revenue to raise wages for the public sector workers to ward off further civil unrest. In Libya, protests erupt after the arrest of a human rights campaigner in February. Despite the heavy repression of these protests and the media blackout, Gaddafi does begin to lose control of the country and goes into hiding, encouraging his loyalists with TV broadcasts. 27th of February, just weeks after these protests erupt, a National Transitional Council is formed to act as an interim government and the political face of the revolution. March, Libya's revolutionary leadership urges Western powers to assassinate Gaddafi. And by August, the National Transitional Council moves its interim government to the capital. In Israel, a significant large-scale demonstration takes place in June, commonly referred to by the media as the Cottage cheese boycott. This event saw an Israeli public protest against the high cost of many products, specifically in this case the cost of cottage cheese. Beginning in July, as a result of a Facebook group, protesters set up tents in the centre of Tel Aviv to highlight the high cost of housing. Protests quickly expand in scope to embrace a wider set of grievances, disability rights, freedom from prisoners of war, and more care for the elderly, among other things. So a bit of a chart there, just showing how widespread this unrest was. So the colour code here, you've got minor protests in the paler colours, then you've got major protests, then you've got governments overthrown, and the darkest colour here is a government overthrown multiple times. So it just shows how widespread this unrest became. And the unrest does actually cross the Mediterranean. So looking first at Spain. Throughout the 2000s, the property boom had sustained the economy. Won't be familiar to anyone here, I'm sure. 2008 financial crisis, though, puts an end to that boom, as you can see from the chart. Unemployment rate increases by over a third, from 17.4% later rising to 21.3%. For youth unemployment, the figure was around 50%. By July 2009, following the economic crash of 2008, Spanish economy has shed 1.2 million jobs. The government allocates €3 billion to restructure the banks, and then cuts €15 billion from public services. January 2011, users on social media websites create the platform Democracy Really Are, Real Democracy Now. The movement called on the unemployed, the poorly paid, the subcontractors, the precarious young people to take to the streets on the 15th of May. Quote here from the book, they call us indignados. It had been building since the protests against the war in Iraq. Our politicians could not be trusted. Corruption cases, broken promises, and a stiff two-party system only helped to accelerate the process. It was the spring of 2011 and the financial crisis had already kicked in hard. Many people lost their jobs and now they were losing their houses. If the crisis had a face in Spain, it was that of the unemployed, of families evicted from their homes. And this is the encampment that emerged in Madrid. And a quote here from Oscar den Houten's book, First Wave, A Year of Revolution, which when I was initially researching the course I taught the WA that I faced tonight, tonight's presentation is a condensed version of that. This was one of the few books in English that had been published at that time, looking at what was happening in Southern Europe. I witnessed various demonstrations in Rome and Florence when I lived in Italy, but I've always had the feeling it was a kind of ritual outlet of frustration. People take to the streets for a day to protest, and afterwards they continue to bow their heads as if they never really believed in it. But here they do. The citizens have occupied the square, and they don't plan on leaving. They mean what they say. Inspired by the Spanish movement, Direct Democracy Now! Forms in Greece, again organising protests on May 25th, and 30,000 people protest in Athens. In the UK, the unrest begins with students. Liberal Democrats, led by Nick Clegg, had ridden a wave of centre-left support in the May 2010 election. The party's MPs had signed a pre-election pledge not to raise university tuition fees. And then after gaining power as part of a Conservative-led coalition, they promptly signed up to support the tripling of university fees to £9,000 a year, as well as abolishing a small weekly grant for low-income school students. And this is met with protests. I don't want to show too many videos in this one, but I think this is a particularly good speech. I will show the video for this. So this is at the time, 15 years old, who was leading some of these protests. Oh, yeah, might do.
Okay.
Yeah, we good?
On stage, our final speaker for the session, Bartleby, who's a high school student who got kept with late, didn't get back to school in time. I'm not sure what the repercussions of that been so far. I'm sure you'll tell us. Thanks very much, Bartleby.
Well, I might be in detention all week, and the school might not be very happy, but we sure showed something much bigger last Wednesday. Okay, sorry. You know, this was meant to be the first post-ideological generation, right? This was meant to be the generation that never thought of anything bigger than our Facebook profiles and our TV screens. This was meant to be the generation where the only thing that Saturday night meant was X Factor. I think now that claim is quite ridiculous. I think now that claim is quite preposterous. I think now we've shown that we are as ideological as ever before. Now we've shown that solidarity and comradeship and all those things that used to be associated with students are as relevant now as they've ever been. You know, the most incredible thing that happened on Wednesday, I went down, I thought I was going to go down in lunch break and then get back in time for lessons. Perhaps I should have known they put the guy in charge of the G20 in charge. Perhaps I should have been more concerned for my life than whether I was going to get down for lessons. But when I tried to get out and I was told it was a sterile area by police officers standing and not letting anyone out, I thought, well, that's why we need a university education. If we don't get one, we end up in police uniforms. You know, when I was Kennegan there, I was with thousands and thousands of school students who'd come down with their ties around their heads in their school uniforms, and yeah, they were cold, who'd come down, who'd never been on a protest before, who'd never joined a political party or been involved in a political movement before, who didn't have any economic knowledge or political degrees, but they were there because they believed in something. They were there because they believed in something bigger, and they were there because they knew that either, you know, there weren't a million choices, there were two choices. Either they laid down and took whatever the government threw at them, or they stood up and fought back. And so those school students who'd never been involved in anything before stood up and they fought back. And when they were in that kettle, being kettled in by police, you know, the word went around as we were sitting, huddling around fires, sharing out the little food we had, and the word went around, people said, we know what they're up to. We know that they don't think we're a danger to the public. I'm 15 years old, people there were as young as 13. We know they don't think we're going to run riot through the streets of London. We know what they're up to. They think that if they kettle us now, we're not going to come on a demonstration ever again. Well, let the word go out from today, people said. Let the word go out about next Tuesday. Let the word go out about next week and next month and next year. That they can't stop us demonstrating. They can't stop us fighting back. And however much they try to imprison us in the streets of London, those are our streets, and we will always be there to demonstrate. We will always be there to fight. People who had always thought that the police were just those people at the other end of the telephone line to help if there was a burglary. People who'd always thought that the media were just those friendly newspaper men who were there to give them that unbalanced picture of the facts. People learned a lot last Wednesday. People learned a lot as they huddled round fires and then emerged from that kettle to see headlines like vandals on the Evening Standard that afternoon. People learned a lot when a police van was left in the middle of the road so that the police could tow it away and show the whole public, look what vandals these people are. People learned a lot. So the message that goes out from last Wednesday is very clear. We are no longer that post-ideological generation. We are no longer that generation that doesn't care. We are no longer that generation that's prepared to sit back and take whatever they give us. We are now the generation at the heart of the fight back. We are now the generation that will stand with everyone who's fighting back. The most inspiring thing, I think, was that just after Wednesday, hundreds of people joined a Facebook group, school students joined a Facebook group in solidarity with RMT members on strike. Those are people who previously thought tube strikes was something annoying because they stopped them getting into school. Now they think they've got to link arms and fight back with everyone. So we want to show solidarity with everyone who's fighting back. We hope you'll show solidarity with us and send a strong message to this government that they can't throw their cuts at us. We're going to stand up and we're going to fight back.
So on March 26, 2011, the Trade Union Congress organised the March for the Alternative. Estimates put the attendance at somewhere between 250,000 and 500,000, the biggest trade union demonstration in post-war history in the UK. And pretty soon the movement crosses the Atlantic. So this is the call out from Adbusters magazine. September 17th, Wall Street, brings and hashtag Occupy Wall Street. I'm going to come back to that because before Occupy Wall Street, there were some things happening in Wisconsin. February 2011, public sector workers began protests against a bill that would significantly curtail collective bargaining rights. 14 Senate Democrats fled the state to prevent the quorum necessary for a vote on the bill as protesters occupied Senate chambers. And Wisconsin's protesters draw inspiration from what's happening in Egypt. And likewise, the protesters in Egypt show their solidarity with the public sector workers protesting in Wisconsin. So Occupy Wall Street. June 2011, Carl Larson from Adbusters registers occupywallstreet.org. July 13th, they make the initial proposal for a peaceful demonstration to Occupy Wall Street, starting that hashtag Occupy Wall Street. August 2nd, two groups join in a demonstration at the Charging Bull sculpture before gathering into working groups to plan for the September 17th event. Quote from one of the people at these meetings. I hooked up with a group of friends and we had an assembly with a bunch of strangers and talked economics for 2 or 3 hours. It was kind of nice to be at a protest and instead of marching and shouting, to be talking about ideas. It felt like the script had changed. Someone asked what the action was, what we were going to do, and someone else responded that this was the action. We were there to talk and organise. That's the Taylor. So these Occupy Wall Street activists launched the website wearethe99%.tumblr.com. I remember Tumblr from the early 2010s. Inviting people to let us know who you are. Take a picture of yourself holding a sign that describes your situation. For example, I am a student with $25,000 in debt, or I need surgery and my first thought wasn't if I'm going to be okay, it was how I would afford it. Below that, write, I am the 99%. So a couple of examples there. No degree, no financial aid, no chance of finishing college, no hope for the future. I am the 99%. I'm a full-time student with no job currently, and I have to choose, will I eat today or will I buy gas to go to class? I am the 99%. I'm retired, I live on savings and retirement and social security. I'm okay, 50 million Americans are not. They are poor, have no health insurance or both, but we are the 99%. Single mom, grad student, unemployed, and I paid more tax last year than General Electric. I am the 99%. I'm 16 years old and I'm afraid that my generation will not be able to afford optimism. I read the emails from the 2010.
What do you mean, remember?
I'm a college student terrified of finishing school because I have $50,000 in loans and no prospects of a career. I am the 99%. Quote here from Marco Roth's essay, Letters of Resignation from the American Dream. There is a certain limited but important power behind all these displays of futility. By writing, I am the 99%, or in some cases, we are the 99% at the end of their litanies, the individuals who have chosen to post their post-industrial miseries on the web are doing something that Americans of recent generations have been adverse to doing. They are actually creating class consciousness. And we see these solidarity actions. So September 27th, over 700 continental and United pilots, joined by additional pilots from other airlines and the Airline Pilots Associations, demonstrate in front of Occupy Wall Street. In front of Wall Street, I should say, with Occupy Wall Street. An OWS afternoon march that same day merges with a rally by postal workers protesting against a 5-day delivery week. The next day, the board of the local union of the Transport Workers Union of America votes to support Occupy Wall Street. They went to court to ask for an injunction to stop New York Police Department from compelling city bus drivers to transport arrested Occupy Wall Street demonstrators. A quote here from the union spokesman. We're a pretty mainstream blue-collar union. We view the protests as young people who are articulating the same kind of things that we've been trying to articulate. Then the Spanish movement, the Real Democracy Now!, puts out the call for protests to take place around the world on October the 15th, the 5-month anniversary of Spain's protests. And they do. There are protests in approximately 2,000 cities around the world, on every continent. Literally every continent. And just going back to the map, it does look from this map that it's a very Western phenomenon, even though this is, of course, the movement started in North Africa. But this is just the campsites that are calling themselves Occupy or indignados in the case of a lot of Europe. So I want to include this quote here from Arundhati Roy. Occupy Wall Street has joined thousands of other resistance movements all over the world, in which the poorest people are standing up and stopping the richest corporations in their tracks. Few of us dreamed that we would see you, the people of the United States, on our side, trying to do this in the heart of empire. I don't know how to communicate the enormity of what this means. So following the call by Democracy Aurelia to start global protests, Occupy camps start in Auckland, New Plymouth, Wellington, Christchurch and Dunedin. Later one does start in Invercargill as well. I think there was very briefly one in Tauranga as well. I have a short video here from the Christchurch encampment. Please go back to the video for, well, the audio for.
It's okay. Thank you for that.
Right.
They say none of your tracks. Why? Because we're occupied.
So the book, coming back to that now, so this, as I mentioned, is an oral history from 14 people who participated in the protests, and I do have copies for sale here if you'd like to get one. $20. Cut money goes essentially to recoup the cost of printing it, and also to keep the website online as well as being in the book. Transcripts and all the audio is online at occupychristchurch.nz, and I hope to keep that online in perpetuity. I guess with that we'll open up to questions, comments, discussion.
Hey, thanks for that was very good. Just wanted to see, like, I know that Australia in particular was pretty well insulated from the global financial crisis, and New Zealand probably wasn't as bad as the rest of the Western world as well. Were the movements and the activities sort of like as ideologically similar as the rest of the world's protests as well?
I think they're similar, but maybe not as driven as some of the ones overseas, because we didn't have the high unemployment that they had in Europe and other places. It was actually, despite all the people who go by the protest encampment and get a job, it was very hard to like get enough people there during the day, because most people had jobs to go to or had to go to university. So it wasn't a lot of people who could just spend all their time there. But it was very focused on those economic issues. One of the events that a few people talk about in the book is like a Labour Day march that was held, where people just talked about their own experiences in the workforce, and the low pay, the long hours, the conditions, those sort of things. And while we may not have had it as bad as young people in Spain, there was an awareness of that, as well as the levels of inequality that existed in this country then and still exist a decade later. There were, of course, locally specific stuff as well, like in Christchurch. We were in the aftermath of the earthquake, so there was a protest outside EQC at one point, and various things related to that, and the City Council giving their CEO an enormous pay rise, despite the fact they'd been on leave, I think, for half the year or something, and there were protests about that. So it was global and local in terms of what it encompassed.
Could you comment at all on the efficacy of these movements, or the magnitude in relation to their magnitude, whether it's in the Arab Spring part of it or in the States, or is it like? Yeah.
Well, in North Africa, they overthrew governments,
Yeah.
so I guess that's quite effective. I mean, there's I'm probably more clued up on the region 10 years ago than now, so I couldn't really say how much better off people are in those areas, in those countries now, following those changes. But there were some pretty significant reforms, like the renationalisation of things in Egypt, for example, and I think it built a lot of solidarity between trade unions and student movements and things in these countries and in Southern Europe, and I think in the States as well. There were a few sort of lasting things I know from some of the encampments in the States. In one city they sort of merged into creating a village for homeless people, because in all these cities they became, after the first few months, people realised, we can go there and we can get free food and somewhere to sleep, and so a lot of homeless people started coming, including here in this country, and so some of the movements kind of emerged into working around housing issues. I think as well, for a lot of people, I'd been involved in activism since the Iraq War and going on anti-war demonstrations, but for a lot of people in 2011 it was their first involvement in some kind of protest activity, and that encouraged them to maybe get more involved. And I think there's people who maybe got their start in the Occupy movements, or the solidarity movements overseas, who have gone on to do other things. So
Yeah, you also mentioned that it was for some people like a development of class consciousness,
Yeah,
which is quite a
absolutely.
thing.
Yeah, but I take everything you said, Byron, but isn't it true that certainly in Africa, all the gains that were made after 2011 have now been rolled back? I think Tunisia is the last country to maintain those democratic gains, and even they're now looking like very shaky to say the least. Spain, well, we all know what's happening in Spain and Greece. Podemos has collapsed. So, I mean, what's your take on that? I mean, it was a massive movement. It involved thousands of people, but in the end, tangible gains or long-lasting gains, should I say, have been minimal. Why do you think that is?
Oh, good question.
That's a big question. Chances of being cynical, I'm not being factual. It's just, you know, I mean, Egypt, Tunisia, the gains have been rolled back.
Yeah, I mean, you may know more about the current situation in some of these countries than I do, to be honest. But I guess with anything like this, it's where the power lies, and I think for a year we had a bit of a demonstration in how you can have power among the populace, among the working class, but really they only exercised that power to a point that it could still then be crushed, even if that took a few years for that to happen. And of course, I didn't mention, I only really touched on in some of the countries where this unrest was happening, like Yemen, it did lead to a civil war, and Libya and Syria led to a civil war that's still going on now. So, yeah, not leading to great things everywhere with this unrest happened. And I think places like Syria, the unrest happened because they did have a particularly brutal dictator, but then the movement was really violently put down by that regime. I'll give you a few hands. I think Tom was first.
I'll jump in and then I'll help chair because a few people are.
That's a good idea.
Yeah. Okay. I guess I was sort of wondering how much you thought the Occupy movement, the Eastern Rebellion, and the Iraq War protests, like while you've emphasised sort of this is a new energy coming from a new generation, I think there are other accounts of it where it was almost like the last gasp of the anti and ultra-globalisation movement in the 90s, and whether if the rollbacks are so obvious, perhaps it's because of that, because they were actually the last gasp or the last bit of petrol in the tank of an earlier movement, and the new generation, while they were enthusiastic, did not have the sort of organisational roots to really drive anything else other than like a relatively briefly won games. So if you have any comments on that, other than that, I'll just start taking names with you.
Yeah,
I'll do that and you do.
Yeah, I think in a way it was a bit of a last gasp for the kind of ultra-globalisation movements. Like obviously the call to Occupy Wall Street was put out by ad-busters who kind of came out of that era of social movements. I mean, myself, I was sort of too young really for like things like the Battle of Seattle and big events like that. I was in primary school at the time, so there were a lot of young people who didn't come out of that. But yeah, I think particularly in the States and Canada, maybe more so, some of the organisers and things have come out of that. But at the same time, we did see new organisers emerging from the young people then. And I know there's people who touched on people who today have got their start in the Occupy movements and are now involved in other things like Black Lives Matter and things like that, in North America in particular.
We've got Shannon, then Paul, and I think David, you have your hand up before as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to affirm that and say that 2011 I was literally just 20, and like I was just at uni and not very political, but this was the first, I can't say much about like the world politically before and after that, but this was like a really significant moment after the earthquakes here, and it was the thing that politicized me a little bit, or it happened at a time when I was like feeling very politicized. So I think you can't, maybe underplay the fact that, people who were disenfranchised for various reasons, this was the whole point of it, right? Like it had very broad message and something that people could buy into for various reasons. And so post-earthquake, people who were feeling very disenfranchised but didn't necessarily, because things had been so dead politically in terms of protests and stuff, didn't really have like a bit of a model or a tradition to buy into, actually found a place to, and you know, now I'm like, oh, don't know if I agree with that, but you know, but it was a thing that started me off, so you know, I just think it's very easy to be very dismissive of it, but yeah.
Shannon is in the book, by the way. I don't think I mentioned, but in Christchurch, was in terms of the New Zealand occupation, it was the longest running one, and I think part of that was the effects of being in that post-earthquake situation, and maybe that meaning people had more that they were protesting against than in some of the other centres.
I think we're going to Paul then David.
Do you not think, Byron, that it might be a bit too, I don't mean to sound at all, but simplistic to look at all these events right around the world, like speakers and internationalists, and conflate them as something where there are inherent similarities. For example, in the Arab countries, they have a history of very recent colonialism and very recent wars of liberation. We haven't had that. Similarly, in some of those countries, you mentioned Yemen, for example, it seems to me that the ongoing disputation is between different religious groups. God help us from religion, if you'll forgive the expression. So that's, we don't have that here, not now, we used to. But here, I'm long enough in the truth, that should be glaringly obvious, to recall things like the agitation against the Vietnam War. And there were tens of thousands of mostly young people leading the charge. And I asked the question, where are they now? Those that haven't fallen off the perch, you know. There are some of us here, but it's the same with the Occupy. It's the same with all those mass movements where people respond out of an inherent, instinctive sense of outraged injustice.
In like the 60s, Capital was like, these people have too much time, let's make, I'm speaking out of turn, David's like, you're speaking out of turn. That's where
Discipline, comrade.
you
But
become
when that
otherwise
issue
engaged.
is gone, it abates. And it seems to me that that's because there is no, and your presentation used the word ideology. There is no ideology involved in it. It's instinctive, it's natural, it's organic, if you like to use a modern word. But do we not need to ensure that when people do take action on issues of great importance, where they feel strongly about things, that there is some indication, there's a sense of history and, if you like, what makes it worthwhile to keep going. The issue is gone.
So, a few things on that. So yeah, I think in the presentation I gave tonight, which is sort of a condensed version of a sort of four evening long course I taught at the WA, I have condensed it a bit, and I think glossed over a wee bit some of the differences between these different countries where these things were happening. So Yemen, of course, as Paul mentioned, different religious factions, and I think I see multiple opposition groups. Some of those opposition groups being like Islamic terrorist groups of different persuasions, and the civil war that erupted in there. I mean, it came a bit from some of this civil unrest driven by economic concerns, but also that opened up a bit of space for those Islamic terrorist groups to try and capture territory and things. And similar thing in Syria as well. And of course, you can't compare that to the United States or the UK or New Zealand. So I think the other side of it though is while some of these movements didn't directly inspire each other. There was that solidarity between them, like the protesters in Wisconsin and Egypt making the signs to acknowledge each other. And the other thing I didn't talk a lot about in here is things like there was a hacker collective, Anonymous, who when the protests were happening in Egypt and they were being organised online and the Egyptian regime shut down the internet in the whole country, Anonymous was active at getting people there online, not because they had any particular ideological agreement with them necessarily, but just because they were a bunch of young nerds who thought that government shutting down the internet was an inherently bad thing. So there were these international links and this international solidarity, but at the same time, yeah, very, very different situations that can't really all be conflated into one movement. And in terms of the second part, regarding like where do these people go after we have these big sort of spontaneous, organic protests, and I'm not quite as old as Paul, but I have seen like with the demonstrations against the war in Iraq, which were quite significant, and then yeah, after that, you know, where are all these people that were on these demonstrations? Where did they go after that? And yeah, then again with the Occupy movement, and having been highly involved myself with environmentalism, you see a bit of that as well. There's very big demonstrations, and then people tend to be a bit more missing in action. But with all that, though, you get key people coming out of it. You know, you get people who maybe as a teenager attended the Occupy event, and I mean, one of the things we did at the Christchurch occupation was a thing we called the Open Air University, which came out of people wanting to spend the discussion times having these big discussions about political theory or whatever, and other people would get annoyed and say, no, we need to sort out who's emptying the composting toilet this week or whatever. And so we organised, separate from the General Assemblies, this event that we called the Open Air University, where people could sign up to essentially run a class out there in Hagley Park about whatever. So I gave a talk in the park explaining the later theory of value to people, and there were similar things to that. So I think people did get a little bit of education out of that, and then some of them maybe from that then decided to go and do formal education or to pursue a greater involvement in the union or things like that. I think we didn't sustain a mass movement, but I think you get some individuals going through that and then going on to maybe make a difference. But yeah, I don't know how we would get that a sustained mass movement again from that. A bigger discussion.
Cool. I think I've got David and Roy, and I think Rick will use your call. I might close it off after Rick, unless there's any further question, just so we don't have here all evening. We can sort of hang out and we can chat prior about the book. But I'll go to David, then Roy, then Rick. If anyone's got a burning question, please wait for me. So otherwise,
first of all, just to complete Paul's spiel, the whole, movements, people get involved, movements die down, what continues. That's why we need Socialist Party, comrades, to continue to organise the militant activists between the upsurges and the struggle. In terms of was it the last gasp of the anti-capitalist movement and the Iraq War stuff, Seattle-Iraq War stuff, I haven't been involved in those. Yeah, I mean, there were quite a few of us that were involved in both things, but I think actually no, it was there was the whole Gen X versus millennial sort of generational divide, and I think the Iraq War, the fact that the Iraq War went ahead really demoralised the movement at that time, and that lasted for a good 5 or so years until the global economic crisis, and then Occupy was several years after that. So you're actually talking about a good 7-8 years between the end of the Iraq War protests in 2003 and the rise of Occupy and those movements. So I think it was a new thing in a way, and I think it laid the groundwork for all of those electoral movements. So Podemos in Spain, and then Corbyn in the UK, and the Sanders campaign in the US. And I think without those things, and that turn by some of that movement to socialism, Canterbury Socialist Society probably wouldn't exist. So it's ongoing. I mean, Martin and I have been reading up on 1951, preparing a little zine, and you know, most of our big movements end up in defeats, sometimes brutally crushing defeats. But the question is, what continues from that? And you know, things did continue from Occupy. I was involved in the first demonstration of Occupy Auckland, and then I had to leave Auckland and come back down here because my partner at the time needed a doctor's visit to confirm their beneficiary status. I suppose that would have been written on my I am the 99% at the time, right? But we got one of those cheap bus rides, $7 bus tickets down to Invercargill, and we went down to Dunedin and Invercargill, and we visited the Occupy camps there. I even stayed a night at the Invercargill one. In November, in Invercargill, it snowed. FYI, camping outdoors in Invercargill, even in the summer, is not a great idea. But the interesting thing about the Invercargill one is that one of the things they did, they had a generator. There was there was a dozen of them. They had a projector set up, and they got a DVD posted down to them from someone in Dunedin, and it was a kind of conspiracy theory greatest hits, like a 17-year-old kid with a webcam explaining how fluoride and chemtrails and all the rest of it is all linked to Al Gore's agenda to depopulate the world to save the environment because he's a baby-eating pagan, blah, 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 blah. Now, some of you will now be familiar with this one, but you might imagine that it's quite a recent thing, but it's been around for a while. So, aside from the more positive re-emergence of class politics with the idea that there is a ruling class, the 1%, and the rest of us are not part of that, and we have conflicting interests and what have you, which I think was a really positive development, and the engagement with labour unions like the Wisconsin struggle and the New York bus drivers and airline pilots and what have you. There was also the rise of conspiracy theorist stuff. And I guess about that time in the US as well, there was probably the Tea Party movement and stuff like that as well. And so I just wonder, I mean, I'm sure I didn't actually get involved with the Christchurch ones, except for I think I visited once, but I'm sure that must have been a current of that here as well. Yeah. And I know that's been a big thing for Byron since then, so I was wondering if you want to, you don't have to, but if you want to talk about how that side of things was very present in Occupy in New Zealand as well.
Yeah. So I heard, I think one long-time socialist at the time described the Occupy movement as a carnival of the oppressed. Like it was, a lot of people with legitimate economic grievances and things, but not a coherent ideology. And we did get, a fair share of conspiracy theorist types. It comes through a bit in some of the interviews in the book. I didn't interview any of the conspiracy theorists who tended to be quite paranoid about, being interviewed and published and things. But it comes through in other people's interviews in there. I don't know if it was the same film that was shown in Invercargill, where the guy in Christchurch who was really into, I think at the time called the Zeitgeist movement, which was
there was that as well in Auckland.
It's kind of disappeared now, but it was a mix of like 9/11 conspiracy theories and obviously when you're talking about the global financial system, it attracts people who have weird ideas like social credit, people like that. So you do get all these different ideologies coming through, and one of the things with when we did the Open Air University at the Christchurch one, it was to give people a chance to present on their ideas, and I think somebody did a presentation on the Illuminati or whatever. But at the same time, the people who are attending those could come and attend a workshop on the later theory of value and other things. So it was a bit of getting people exposed to a whole lot of ideas, and hopefully people were more, at least some people would gravitate more towards the bigger ideas. I don't think all of them did. Looking at the prevalence of a lot of conspiratorial thinking today, it's I think much more significant than it was a decade ago. And we just saw these protests at Parliament yesterday by people there. There were some people there claiming that Jacinda Ardern was actually under house arrest and was secretly wearing an ankle bracelet, and that there are tunnels under Parliament and where children are being read for adrenochrome and all this nonsense like that, which is ridiculous. And it's quite disheartening sometimes looking at these protests like this, and every now and again you can spot someone and be like, they want a TPPA, anti-TPPA march in 2011 or 2012 or whatever, and I think, yeah, a bit of a task for, I guess, it's called the rational thinking left at the time was to counter some of those real ideas, and I think that's a much more difficult task today, a decade later. Don't really have a easy answer for how we do that, but it would be interesting if something like Occupy emerged again, and how it would look different from what it looked like a decade ago. And I think one of the things that would make it look different would be those fringe ideas would probably be a bit less fringe, and maybe someone who's a socialist getting involved might have a bit more difficulty getting a hearing than they would have a decade ago at these encampments.
I've got Roy and then Rick, and then we'll break and just hang out in the leading. So Roy?
I just wanted to say that, like, when you get like massive uprisings like we saw in the Middle East, which then led on to Occupy, it's not like something comes out of the blue and then it disappears forever. You know, in fact, there's, you know, I think you're getting onto this. You know, there's ups and downs going through over a long period of time. And I think one of the advantages now, being older, I mean, we're in a time, you know, Paul and me, when there was a huge amount of protests going on for 20 years, you know. I mean, I heard someone saying the protest in you know, Parliament buildings was huge. Well, it was nothing like protests there have been before that really had a big impact. I won't go into any more on that, but I just wanted to say, like, with the ones in the Middle East, there was just to go back on the fact there's been a lot of struggle in the Middle East coming out of, you know, fighting colonisation that went on for decades, and there was an excellent series of 3 documentaries on Al Jazeera about French decolonisation called Blood and Tears, French Decolonisation. Now it's stopped on Al Jazeera, but you can just Google it online and it's there. Now I'd really recommend it because it's a fantastic expose of imperialism, French imperialism. You know, we're probably more aware of America and Britain, but France was one of the biggest imperial countries, and it led directly to a major protest in New Zealand, which was on the Vietnam War, which really followed on from the war that the Vietnamese have been trying to do to get rid of the French. And anyway, when you look at that, you can see you know, how protests went on for a long time in a lot of Africa and Asia, but it also shows the brutality of the European powers and what they are prepared to do. But it's also, I think it links in with, you know, that's earlier protests in the same areas, you know, in North Africa and West Africa, and but it also shows how difficult it is. You know, like, you can get these big protests, but there are huge forces that then swing into action to smash it. And the big powers like France and Africa, and then other big powers that want to defeat them, and to make sure that if, like, you get new governments emerging, they'll then act to make sure that they're not going to be progressive governments. In the case of the French, they were prepared to assassinate leaders of the former colonies if they were not going to fit in with what France wanted in a post-colonial situation. And that this kind of thing goes on all the time. But there's also other forces that go against the progressive movements, like you had very conservative Islam, you know, which would be linking in with Saudi Arabia, and that also moved into trying to counteract socialist ideas or more progressive or secular ideas. We saw that with Iran in 1979, probably the biggest mass uprising of the 20th century. But at the end, people who are on the progressive side got pushed aside. You know, but it's all part of that struggle. And I guess one way of looking at it, to say, not to get down about it, to think what we can do here in our leisure time, what could working class people do in the mid-19th century? You know, we're working 12, 13, 14-hour days. Women were pregnant, pulling, you know, wagons of coal on their hands and knees in the mines, and you know, no kind of rights whatsoever. Any attempts to try to, like with the Chartist movement, trying to protest to get some kind of voting rights, would be, the leaders would be jailed, and when they marched to the prisons, they would shoot them down in Britain. You know, and if you think of what it was like for working class people then and where it is now, we have actually made some progress. You know, we do have some kind of rights. So we need to see we are getting somewhere, even if it's not where we really want to finish up. But hey, I would really advise people, I would really recommend going online, volunteers, French Decolonization, because it's about 2 hours altogether, because it's 3 episodes, but you'll learn something about a particular power that we don't really hear so much about in English-speaking countries.
Do we need direct responses, or should we move to? Sorry, Martin, I might cut you off.
I feel like Martin's got a very good summary.
I'll let Martin very
Is
briefly
that what,
close up.
if it's what I told Martin to say,
I've got Rick next. Feel free to respond to Rick and Roy maybe at the same time if you like, and then I'll finish with Martin. I really hope to finish by 9, so if we get their comments.
Kia ora tātou. Thanks, Byron, very much for your time you put into both the Occupy movement and making sure it hasn't been lost to history.
thank you. That was
I've got a specific questions in here for you. Sure. And the first one is to do with housing, because as you mentioned, that the symbol of the Occupy event was the tent, and from Wall Street, the homeless people there were engaged with the radicals to provide a solution, a housing solution. So the big question here is this not an example of how, as working class representatives and activists, we need to illustrate that capitalism can't solve the problems of modern society? This is a compounding problem. It's not going to get better. We can see time after time things get worse, and that we have to look back to history as to how to resolve it ultimately as Marxists. We know that. So, as Lenin would have advised, look at the current circumstances. What are the opportunities? Is it a bread riot? Is it the military rebelling against war? Or is it people without housing occupying a public park and developing a massive collectivity around it? Because that's what it was. And in that experience, young activists like yourself and others here, we met the homeless of Christchurch, and there were 2 issues there at the time. Post-earthquake, it was clear that things were too slow, people were underpaid, a lot of unresolved housing damage that still exists today. Families that have died off, been killed by that traumatic event, and the lack of insurance to provide for them. But in the camp, we met the homeless of Christchurch and learnt that they chose to live outside, rough sleepers by choice, to not have an unemployment benefit, to live on the margins. They found more free, more able to look after themselves. They could find a free meal every day of the week from the different charities around the city. And here was something that was a special event for them, something tailor-made for them to come along and socialise and meet other people, be looked after better than they normally were, and actually have a better life for the time of the camp. And I think that kind of explains why Occupy was so strong for so long, because it was real in terms of a housing solution that capitalism wasn't providing.
Right on.
So that's the first question, is to say, if we come forward 10 years, has the New Zealand housing situation been improved? You know, how many
Really
on the
good point.
wait list now compared to then. But at the time, the protest led to a lot of those rough sleepers being jumped up the front of the line for the council housing officers coming down there to the park to meet them and offer them what accommodation they were rapidly trying to make available out of the repairs.
Yeah.
So people actually did get housed out of that if they wanted to. And then the other question I'm going to pose is, it was, as David mentioned, it was 3-4 years after the GFC, the global financial crisis, which rolled through workers all around the world and caused the bread riots, etc., the events in Tunisia and Libya that led to those Arab Spring, and then was amplified through the advanced West. Again, this is a sign that the system isn't providing. There's a glitch in the system. They call it banking crisis, but there was world's record highest price for oil in the month before that happened. That's never explained. When you put the basic energy flow of the economy, put the food in the supermarkets through the roof, it's kind of no wonder things fall apart. So that's my understanding of what GFC actually was, that suddenly no one could afford to move, and things came apart slowly or quite rapidly. But it's said that crisis from that period is still not resolved. It's waiting to come back in a bigger term, and maybe it's actually here now. Maybe this coronavirus has, out of the living conditions we're forced us all to rethink, well, how long will capitalism provide? And maybe this now is this time that we've been waiting so many decades to see that people will see that travelling around the world, having tourist lifestyles is no longer sustainable. We know why. Who's going to solve it? It has to be us. So I'll stop there and thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, right on.
Yeah. So a couple of points on that, I guess. I think a really interesting part of the Occupy Christchurch story that I think hopefully comes through a bit in the book is the way that movement engaged with the homeless population here, who then sort of became part of the movement. And the way the book is organised, it's just organised by interviews with individuals. But through recording this and then doing editing and things, I could sort of see a timeline emerge of how the encampment happened. And it started out with a lot of university students, people who were often new to protests and maybe thought this is a bit like those festivals they go to over the summer, and they'll bring their tent and their fire point or whatever, and then it kind of moved more into the more veteran activists who started to get involved, and then by the end of it, the camp was largely made up of really people who were on the margins, whether they were homeless or just housing insecure, who had come along, frightened away some of those people who were there in the early days, sometimes for legitimate reasons, which I've been quite positive about it really tonight, but I mean it's not all positive, and you'll see some of that in the book. Sometimes for less legitimate reasons, but also I think those really marginalised people started to really sort of take ownership of the movement towards the end, and that's an interesting part of the story here. And when I was seeking out people to interview, I really wanted to get someone who had experienced homelessness who was there. And as you can imagine, people who are unhoused can be difficult to track down, but I did manage to interview somebody in that situation. So I was glad to get that perspective down there in the recordings of it as well. The housing situation now is so much worse than a decade ago, and it could be one of those things that sparks some future event like Occupy. There's a new generation now who were primary school when Occupy was happening, and what's going to happen when those people are finishing their studies, and if we have another economic recession and there's less job prospects, let alone being able to afford one of these $1 million houses, and what could happen there. I think, it'd be interesting to see and interesting to think about how people who are part of the organised left at the moment might intervene in such a thing if it happens. And that sort of possibility is also a reason why I wanted to do this project. People can look at this and say, what was done right, what was done wrong, what can we learn from. You know, if something like that does emerge as a result of another economic crisis and another generation now thinking they've got no future, can't afford optimism, as the one person in there said, if they can not necessarily pick up the book, but if they find it online or whatever and can take something from that, that's something I'm hoping for.
All right, it's just gone 9. Martin, brief thing to wrap
So
up.
yeah, comrade here, I think, said it very briefly, but I'll just say it a bit longer that how important this is that you've done. You know, this is the history that our rulers don't want us to read. These are the things they want to forget, and it's so hugely important that these people who are involved in this are recorded, so we can look back, we can learn, and we can, you know, we can celebrate our history and not the history they want us to have. So, congratulations, great job.
Thank you. Just briefly on that, yeah, I talked mostly about the history of these movements rather than talking about the project itself, but yeah, oral history is something really important because it does reflect that history that wouldn't be there otherwise. And you know, I'd really like to see a situation where, like, the union movement had their own historians who would actually go and do these histories of industrial disputes and things like that. And I mean, certainly, if anyone here is interested in doing any kind of oral history project on labour history or social movements, I'm more than happy to lend a hand with that. I did some training in oral history at the National Library when I did this project, so I have some skills there. And while I'm keeping myself busy doing a YouTube channel and various things these days, certainly doing more oral history projects in the future is something I hope to do, because yeah, it is important. And like I said at the start, I partly recorded this history because I worried that if I didn't do it, nobody would.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you, Byron, for your time. Another round of applause, and then we'll bring in